From Pacifica, this is Democracy Now!
We're doing very well in Iraq. Our soldiers are fighting and fighting like never before, and the results are very, very good.
14 years after the U.S. invaded Iraq, the war shows no signs of letting up. So far this month, the U.S. has dropped over 2,000 bombs on the city of Mosul. In one strike, up to 200 civilians were killed. Hundreds more have died in other U.S. strikes in Iraq and Syria. Meanwhile, the Pentagon's also expanding its role in the Saudi-led war in Yemen. We'll get the latest on Iraq and Yemen, then to a historic debate at the United Nations.
The doomsday clock, indicating how close the humanity is to global catastrophe, has been set at 2.5 minutes to midnight, worst since 1953. Worst than any other time, even at the height of the Cold War.
More than 120 nations have begun drafting a UN treaty to ban nuclear weapons, but the United States is leading a boycott of the talks. We'll find out why. All that and more coming up. Welcome to Democracy Now!, democracynow.org, The War and Peace Report. I'm Amy Goodman. A federal judge in Hawaii dealt another blow on Wednesday to President Trump's attempt to ban refugees and travelers from 6 majority Muslim countries. District Judge Derek Watson extended a nationwide halt on Trump's executive order, which would bar citizens of Iran, Libya, Somalia, Sudan, Syria, and Yemen from entering the United States for 90 days and all refugees for 120 days. In his ruling, Judge Watson said Trump's executive order ran afoul of the First Amendment's Establishment Clause, which bars discrimination on religious grounds. In North Carolina, state Republican lawmakers say they've struck a deal to overturn a law denying transgender people the use of the bathroom, changing room, or locker room that matches their gender identity. But LGBTQ groups say the planned repeal of HB 2, the so-called bathroom bill, will not end discrimination. The deal would allow the state to continue regulating bathrooms while barring local governments from enacting their own anti-discrimination laws until late 2020. Human Rights Campaign said in a tweet, quote, "Any North Carolina lawmaker who supports this bad HB 2 so-called deal is no ally of LGBTQ people and will have planted themselves on the wrong side of history," unquote. The deal came hours ahead of a deadline set by the NCAA to repeal the law or face an end to collegiate athletic tournaments, including lucrative men's basketball games through 2022. It's not clear whether the compromise will prevent an NCAA boycott. On Capitol Hill, the Senate Intelligence Committee is set to hold its first hearing today on alleged Russian meddling in the U.S. election. On Wednesday, Republican Committee Chair Richard Burr promised a thorough investigation.
Tomorrow's hearing, which will be the first public hearing that we've held, is to examine Russian capabilities, their capabilities to influence elections globally, what Russia has done in the past, which is important for us to bring to light for the American people, what they're doing today both here and throughout the world.
The Senate Intelligence Committee plans to question 20 witnesses about Russia's role in November's election and alleged ties between top Trump aides and Russian officials. The Senate investigation came as an investigation the House Intelligence Committee ground to a halt after Committee Chair Republican Devin Nunes refused to step down amidst charges he colluded with the Trump administration to undermine the investigation. The White House said Wednesday President Trump's daughter Ivanka will officially join the administration as a federal employee and unpaid advisor to the president. The move came after ethics groups blasted the administration for arranging a West Wing office and security clearance for Ivanka Trump, who previously had no official role in the administration and had not signed an ethics pledge required of federal employees. This month, Ivanka handed over day-to-day control of her company to a top executive, but critics say she continues to hold power over her business and could use her position in the White House for personal gain. Ivanka Trump will work alongside her husband, Jared Kushner, who serves as senior advisor to the president. Meanwhile, Kushner's real estate firm on Wednesday said it had ended talks with a Chinese company to develop a Manhattan high-rise at 666 Fifth Avenue. The deal would have seen a $400 million payout from a firm with deep ties to the Chinese power structure. The talks collapsed as the Senate Intelligence Committee prepared to question Kushner about meetings he arranged at Trump Tower last December with the Russian ambassador and the head of the U.S.-sanctioned Russian state bank. The meetings came before Donald Trump's inauguration, but after he was elected. The White House sent mixed signals Wednesday about whether President Trump will try again to revamp the nation's health care system following the collapse last week of a House bill that would have repealed parts of the Affordable Care Act. This is President Trump speaking Tuesday night at the White House.
I know that we're all going to make a deal on health care. That's such an easy one. So I have no doubt that that's going to happen very quickly. I think it will, actually. I think it's going to happen because we've all been promising, Democrat, Republican, we've all been promising that to the American people.
On Wednesday, Press Secretary Sean Spicer said President Trump was joking when he made those remarks, adding that another effort at passing health care legislation remains an ongoing discussion. Meanwhile, the president is calling for even deeper cuts to the National Institutes of Health after proposing a 20% cut to the agency in his budget proposal earlier this month. On Tuesday, the president suggested slashing an immediate $1.2 billion from the agency. The cuts would halt medical research already underway, end the State Department's Global Health Security Fund, and shave tens of millions of dollars from programs combating HIV, AIDS, and teen pregnancy. A new Gallup poll shows President Trump's approval rating has fallen to 35%, the lowest level ever recorded for a president this early in a first term. Trump's approval rating is now lower than President Nixon's during the Watergate hearings, President Reagan's during the Iran-Contra investigation, and President George W. Bush's rating after Hurricane Katrina. On Capitol Hill, Senate Majority Leader Mitch McConnell has scheduled a vote on April 7th on whether to confirm Neil Gorsuch as a U.S. Supreme Court justice. Senate Democratic leaders have vowed to filibuster the vote, setting up a confrontation with Republicans who've threatened to change Senate rules to allow Gorsuch to be confirmed by a bare majority rather than 60 senators. In Iraq, a suicide truck bomb struck a police checkpoint south of Baghdad Wednesday, killing 17 people and wounding 40 others. Meanwhile, fighting raged in western Mosul, where civilians remained trapped amidst fighting by U.S.-backed Iraqi forces and ISIS. On Wednesday, the head of U.S. Central Command admitted to a House committee the United States probably played a role in the deaths of as many as 200 civilians in an airstrike on Mosul on March 17th. At the White House, President Trump said Tuesday evening the battle to retake Mosul is going well.
We're doing very well in Iraq. Our soldiers are fighting and fighting like never before, and the results are very, very good.
Meanwhile, Amnesty International continues to criticize the U.S.-backed Iraqi army for having told civilians to stay in Mosul amidst the months-long ongoing offensive rather than to flee. We'll have more on the crisis in Iraq after headlines. The State Department told Congress Wednesday human rights concerns should not hold up a proposed $5 billion sale of F-16 warplanes to the Kingdom of Bahrain, despite a record of torture and killings by the security forces. The move by Secretary of State Rex Tillerson reverses an Obama administration policy tying weapons sales to improvements in Bahrain's human rights record. Bahrain is a close U.S. ally in the Gulf, home to the Navy's Fifth Fleet. The Westinghouse Electric Company filed for bankruptcy protection Wednesday in a major blow to the nuclear power industry. The Chapter 11 filing came as Westinghouse reported huge cost overruns in its efforts to build new nuclear reactors in South Carolina and Georgia. Regulators are now questioning whether the plants will ever be completed. Westinghouse technology is used in more than half the world's nuclear power plants. The company's bankruptcy comes as the cost of electricity from solar and wind farms continues to drop. In California, hundreds of protesters confronted the head of U.S. Immigration and Customs Enforcement Tuesday as he appeared at a town hall meeting in Sacramento. ICE Director Thomas Homan was invited to the forum by Sacramento County Sheriff Scott Jones, a Trump supporter who backs cooperation between police and ICE agents. Among those protesting was Bernard Marks, an 87-year-old Auschwitz Holocaust survivor who compared ICE's actions to the Nazis.
When I was a little boy in Poland, for no other reason but for being Jewish, I was hauled off by the Nazis. And for no other reason, I was picked up and separated from my family, who was exterminated in Auschwitz. And I am a survivor of Auschwitz and Dachau. You stand up here, Mr. Jones, don't forget, history is not on your side.
One protester was escorted out of the town hall after Director Homan insisted his agents don't target immigrants at churches and schools. In Tacoma, Washington, undocumented dreamer Daniel Ramirez Medina was granted bond Wednesday and released from an immigration jail after 6 weeks in ICE custody. Ramirez was arrested in February along with his father, who's an undocumented Mexican immigrant. Ramirez's case drew alarm in immigrant communities since the 23-year-old has permission to live and work in the United States under President Obama's DACA program. Employees at the Department of Energy's Office of International Climate and Clean Energy were warned this week not to use the phrases climate change, emissions reduction, or Paris Agreement in official communications. That's according to Politico, which reported Wednesday that a supervisor prohibited the terms as President Trump signed an executive order Tuesday dismantling a number of climate rules established by President Obama. On Capitol Hill, the head of the Corporation for Public Broadcasting defended the federally funded nonprofit Wednesday against President Trump's call to eliminate funds to the agency. This is Maryland Republican Congressmember Andy Harris, who accused the corporation of political bias after the documentary The New Black by director Yoruba Richin aired on Maryland PBS stations.
It was called The New Black. Says, quote, this is from their website, and I'm going to get to the agenda issue. It says, this film documents the political race for marriage equality in Maryland from the perspectives of LGBTQ African Americans, their supporters, and those who are against marriage equality. I know a lot of people who don't like the term marriage equality.
CPB President Pat Harrison warned that President Trump's proposed cuts would, quote, destroy public media's role in early childhood education, public safety, connecting citizens to our history, and promoting civil discussions, end quote. Trump has also proposed zero funding the National Endowment for the Humanities and the National Endowment for the Arts. In Mexico, journalist Armando Arrieta was hospitalized Wednesday with severe injuries after he was shot 4 times as he arrived at his home in the state of Veracruz. The shooting came less than a day after an unknown assailant shot and killed a bodyguard for another Mexican journalist, Julio Omar Gomez, after his home in Baja California was set on fire. There have been at least 5 attacks on Mexican journalists so far this month, and Mexico's Human Rights Commission says over 120 journalists have been killed since 2000. And in Puerto Rico, thousands of students at the territory's largest public university launched one-week strike on Tuesday. The students are protesting plans by a federally appointed oversight control board to cut $450 million from the university's budget to help pay the island's debt to bondholders. This is psychology professor Mary Olga Reyes-Cruz.
But really, the only ones who have been able to stop us and make us to think and address the crisis have been the students. A shutdown is not only a reaction to the situation, but it is also necessary to be outside of our daily routines and business as usual, so we can have conversations and take on concrete actions.
The striking students are demanding reforms, including an end to budget cuts, no tuition increases, and an independent audit of Puerto Rico's debt. And those are some of the headlines. This is Democracy Now!, democracynow.org, The War and Peace Report. I'm Amy Goodman.
And I'm Nermeen Sheikh. Welcome to our listeners and viewers around the country and around the world. The Iraq War started 14 years ago this month, and it's showing no signs of letting up. Since President Trump took office, the U.S. military has expanded its aerial bombing campaign, targeting areas held by the Islamic State. On Tuesday night, Trump briefly talked about the war in Iraq.
We're doing very well in Iraq. Our soldiers are fighting and fighting like never before, and the results are very, very good.
This comes as the Air Force Times is reporting U.S.-backed military aircraft have dropped over 2,000 bombs on the ISIS-held city of Mosul so far this month. According to the journalistic outfit Air Wars, almost 1,500 civilians have reportedly been killed in U.S. airstrikes in Iraq and Syria this month alone. On March 17th, a U.S. airstrike in Mosul reportedly killed up to 200 civilians. The Pentagon is now admitting it carried out an airstrike at the location where the civilians were killed, but U.S. officials are placing part of the blame for the high death toll on ISIS. On Wednesday, the head of U.S. Central Command, Army General Joseph Votel, testified before the House Armed Services Committee.
There's a fair chance that we may have contributed to this, and so now we have moved to the investigation phase. So it'll be a more formalized approach to really look into the details of this as much as we can to establish what happened, establish what the facts are, identify accountability, and then certainly identify the lessons learned out of that.
Meanwhile, Amnesty International is reporting hundreds of Iraqi civilians have been killed by U.S.-led airstrikes inside their homes or in places where they sought refuge following Iraqi government advice not to leave during the offensive to recapture the city of Mosul. This is Wa'ad Altai speaking about his family members who were killed in November after they followed the Iraqi government's instructions not to leave the city.
My son, Youssef, aged 9, my daughter, Shahad, aged 3, my brother Mahmoud, Ahmed Mahmoud, his wife, Manaya, and their son, Oz Mahmoud, and my other niece, Hanan Saad Ahmed.
We're joined now by Donatella Rivera, who is a senior crisis response advisor at Amnesty International. She's joining us from London. She was last in Mosul 2 weeks ago. Donatella, welcome to Democracy Now! Can you tell us what you found there? Tell us about what happened on March 17th and about the Iraqi government telling people not to leave their homes, then bombing them.
With regard to the strike that happened on March 17, the details are really not known as yet. There are allegations, there are reports. We at Amnesty International have not had a chance to investigate that particular attack on the ground as yet. The United States has now promised to carry out an investigation. The Iraqi authorities initially denied that the alleged strike was the work of the coalition, but rather that it had been an ISIS attack. But now there seems to be admission that that strike was indeed an airstrike from the coalition. However, what I would like to draw your attention to is the fact that civilians have been killed in their homes from the very beginning of the operation to recapture Mosul, which started in October of last year. All the cases that I investigated during my time on the ground in Mosul were in East Mosul between the end of October and late January, when that part of the city was completely recaptured by Iraqi forces. And family after family I spoke to, the sites that I visited were all of homes, civilian homes, that had been struck, and their residents or the people who were sheltering in those homes were killed. And that was indeed after Iraqi forces had dropped leaflets telling people, advising them to remain in their homes. So the fact that civilians were residents of Mosul were in their homes was very well known prior to the beginning of the military campaign. Similarly, the fact that ISIS militants use civilians as human shields in addition to carry out countless other crimes, that too was well known both to Iraqi forces and to the members of the coalition, the US-led coalition that is taking the lead in the air campaign. So provisions should have been made to take into account that particular fact in order, as deciding what kind of military strategy to pursue to recapture the city. What I have seen on the ground is entire homes, sometimes 2 or 3 houses, one next to the other, having been completely destroyed, reduced to rubble. And of course, those civilians who were in those houses, in many cases, really had no chance of coming out alive. And in most of those cases, the residents and the survivors themselves told me that there were ISIS members who were on the roof or perhaps in the garden or around the house. Certainly, those ISIS militants could have been targeted with munitions that have a smaller blast radius and that create less collateral damage rather than destroy a whole 2- or 3-story house full of civilians because of 2 or 3 ISIS militants on the roof.
Well, Donatella, one Republican representative here in the U.S. From Arizona has questioned whether the high standards for avoiding civilian casualties should not be met. In fact, that they're, quote, ridiculous because they allow ISIS militants to use civilians as a defense so that ISIS can, quote, live to fight another day. So do you think this policy by the U.S. To avoid as many civilian casualties as possible is likely to change, or indeed has it already changed?
Well, obviously we're not privy to that level of details, to the details of the exact rule of engagements. We are aware that there have been discussions in the media and elsewhere about possible relaxation of the rules of engagement in recent weeks. I don't know whether that's the case or not, but certainly, even if the rules of engagements have not changed and remain what they were at the beginning of the operation, what I have seen on the ground in East Mosul suggests and actually strongly indicates that not everything that could and indeed should have been done to spare civilians, to protect civilian life, has been done. At Amnesty International, we're not naive to the fact that urban warfare inherently carries risks for civilians, and that it would be naive to hope that a war in the middle of a city like Mosul could happen without any civilian casualties. Those, unfortunately, are part of that particular equation. However, that fact alone and the fact that ISIS uses civilians as human shields do not in any way relieve the fighting parties, in this case the US-led coalitions, as well as the Iraqi forces who are doing the fighting on the grounds, do not relieve them of their obligation under international law. It is plainly clear that it is possible to take additional measures to protect civilians. And, as I said earlier, the choice of munitions when fighting in a densely populated urban area is paramount. A margin of error or even just a few meters, using munitions that have a much wider blast radius will ultimately put at greater risks civilians who are in the vicinity of the target itself.
Well, precision
munitions are available. They have been used in other theaters. They have been used in Iraq as well at other times. And they could help to minimize civilian casualties.
This is what Defense Secretary James Mattis said this week when he was asked about the increased number of civilian casualties in and around Mosul.
There is no military force in the world that has proven more sensitive to civilian casualties. We are keenly aware that every battlefield where an enemy hides behind women and children is also a humanitarian field, and we go out of our way to always do everything humanly possible to reduce the loss of life or injury among innocent people. The same cannot be said for our adversaries, and that's up to you to sort out.
So if you can respond to that, Donatella Rivera, and also clearly it took a lot for the U.S. to say that they were going to investigate. The mounting evidence of what happened on March 17th alone, where it looks like possibly over 200 civilians were killed.
Well, first of all, I mean, I would certainly concur with the statement that ISIS hides behind civilians and that ISIS does not care about respecting international law. In fact, it does everything it can to violate it, and does so very openly. That's very true, but that's been known for a long time. And it should have been taken into consideration when planning the military campaign. As for the other part of the statement, that every measure is taken to minimize civilian casualties, I would find it difficult to agree with that because of what I've seen on the ground. As I said, residents in Mosul were very open about the fact that ISIS positions snipers on their rooftops, usually in very small numbers, obviously, again, to avoid being detected. Or that ISIS fighters were going in and out of houses, hanging around in people's gardens, and so on and so forth. Nobody's been denying that. The fact is the kind of measures that have been taken when targeting those ISIS militants, what kind of measures were taken to protect the civilians around them? Because the kind of scenes that I've seen in Mosul is entire houses collapsed, brought down by airstrikes in order to target 1 or 2 or 3 individuals on a rooftop. Every military expert knows that there are other means available, other types of munitions available that will not bring down an entire building, but will take out legitimate targets. I mean, we've seen, even in Mosul, at times in the past, ISIS fighters being taken out while driving on a motorcycle. So, there is no dispute that more precise munitions than large bombs that bring down an entire buildings are available and are being used in other theaters. So, that could help to minimize civilian casualties for sure. With regard to this investigation that is going on, according to statements made by U.S. personnel about the attack of the 17th of March, obviously that's a good thing that there should be an investigation. The investigation should be independent. It should be thorough. But also the same kind of investigation should be conducted, and indeed should have been conducted earlier, into the kind of casualties that have resulted from other strikes that have been taking place earlier on in the campaign from October. And perhaps if that kind of investigation had been done at the end of or during the fight in East Mosul, it might have informed the kind of strategy to be used in West Mosul. There was about a month's pause between the fighting in East Mosul and the renewed fighting in West Mosul. So perhaps if that time had been used to have a proper investigation and a review of civilian casualties that occurred in their hundreds in East Mosul, it might have informed the strategy to pursue in West Mosul, and perhaps incidents such as that reported on the 17th of March with a very large loss of civilian lives, according to reports, perhaps those incidents might have been avoided.
And Donatella, very quickly before we conclude, could you tell us what the situation is of civilians trying to flee West Mosul?
Obviously, fleeing the fighting is very difficult, but we are seeing civilians fleeing West Mosul in much, much greater numbers than the numbers who fled from East Mosul. Partly, perhaps, because the message has got through to civilians that staying in your homes, as they were advised to do, is not necessarily the safest options. And so many more people are taking the risk to try and flee with their families. It is risky for them to remain, and it is risky for them to flee. But we are seeing a much larger number of civilians fleeing West Mosul than was the case for the east part of the city.
Donatella Rivera, I want to thank you for being with us. Senior Crisis Response Advisor at Amnesty International. Organization released a report this week, civilians killed by airstrikes in their homes after they were told not to flee Mosul. This is Democracy Now! When we come back, we look at what's happening in Yemen and the famine that is threatened there, not to mention the escalation of bombings. Stay with us. Baghdad by Ida Nadim, here on Democracy Now!, DemocracyNow.org, The War and Peace Report. I'm Amy Goodman with Nermeen Sheikh.
We turn now to look at Yemen, where the U.S. is also rapidly expanding military operations. The U.S. has reportedly launched more than 49 strikes across the country this month. According to the New York Times, that's more strikes than the U.S. has ever carried out in a single year in Yemen. While the U.S. airstrikes have been targeting suspected al-Qaeda operations in Yemen, the Wall Street Journal is reporting the U.S. is now offering even more logistical and intelligence support for the Saudi-led war against Yemen's Houthi rebels, who are accused of being linked to Iran. More than 10,000 people have been killed since the U.S.-backed Saudi-led bombing campaign in Yemen began 2 years ago this month. Meanwhile, the New York Times is reporting today that the Trump administration has approved the resumption of sales of precision-guided munitions to Saudi Arabia. President Obama froze some of these weapons sales last year due to concern about civilian casualties in Saudi Arabia's expanding war in Yemen.
This all comes as the United Nations is warning Yemen is on the brink of famine. This is UN Emergency Relief Coordinator Stephen O'Brien.
Well, it's not just the number of people who are food insecure, which represents about 14 million out of the 26 million or so Yemenis, which is an enormous number for any nation to have to bear. It's the fact that we have seen an increase in severe acute malnourishment, particularly in young children and in lactating mothers. We have seen a very severe deterioration in the number of patients needing dialysis services, access to oxygen, and where we need to see more antibiotics being brought in and medical facilities made available. These are seriously deteriorating.
To talk more about the situation in Yemen, we go to London to speak with Iona Craig, a journalist who's based in Sana'a from 2010 to 15 as the Yemen correspondent for the Times of London. She was in Yemen again last month, where she reported on January's Navy SEAL raid that left 25 civilians and 1 U.S. Navy SEAL dead. Iona, welcome back to Democracy Now! Talk about the situation on the ground in Yemen right now.
Well, as you already mentioned, the humanitarian situation is certainly getting worse. I went to several of the areas, remote areas, where some of the internally displaced people are finding it increasingly difficult to get access to food and even water. And then on the military front, there is a stalemate on a lot of the on the side of the ground war, whilst also a new offensive was actually launched on the Red Sea coast whilst I was in Yemen in January, that then pushed a lot of the civilian population into these incredibly remote areas where there are no aid agencies to support them and to provide shelter and to provide food. So across the country, really, it doesn't matter which side of the front line you are if you're a civilian. People are finding it increasingly difficult to both access food and to be able to afford to pay for food, because many of the government employees have not been paid for more than 6-7 months now, and so that reduces people's capacity to even purchase goods even when they are available in areas where they're not affected by the conflict. So really, there's a massive sense of war weariness amongst the civilian population. People are just really desperate for this war to come to an end, obviously. But certainly on the political side, there is no indication that is about to happen. And in fact, the warring parties are not even willing to even engage or speak with the UN Special Envoy, who is charged with trying to find a political resolution to the conflict. So both on the military front, things are shifting slightly or have done, but certainly on the humanitarian side, things are getting worse, with the prediction now of wheat supplies soon to run out in perhaps the coming weeks or certainly in the next 2 months, that is only going to get worse as well.
Well, Iona, as this humanitarian situation is worsening, the Trump administration is reportedly planning changes to the U.S. policy in Yemen. Could you tell us a little about the kinds of changes that are being considered and what their impact would be if they're put into place?
So one thing that appears to have already been changed from what we've heard is Yemen now, or parts of Yemen anyway, being regarded as areas of active hostility. Now, that's quite a technical term, but essentially what it means is those selected areas are put on a war footing the same as Iraq and Afghanistan. So previously, under the Obama administration, Yemen was considered an area of outside of active hostility. So there were different protocols put in place to ensure the prevention of civilian casualties. And it meant that when drone strikes or airstrikes or raids were carried out, that there had to be a near certainty that there were no civilian casualties. Obviously, that didn't always work. I've spent many years covering Yemen, and that included covering incidents of mass civilian casualties under the Obama administration. But now, when that changes to putting parts of the country into areas of active hostility, that near certainty basically gets chucked out of the window, and it means that those civilian casualties are kind of allowed and only have to be proportional. So that's obviously very concerning for the civilian population in Yemen. We've also seen more military activity, as you've already mentioned, in the form of airstrikes. So that's more military activity, less oversight, because of the way the command structure is now appears to have been changing as well, in the sense that the military is going to be allowed to take more decisions on that level without the kind of micromanaging the Obama administration was always accused of, as well as removing these protocols that were supposed to, anyway, protect civilian lives. In addition to that, now there is talk of the US wanting to become more involved on the side of the Saudi-led coalition, who, of course, been carrying out this aerial bombing campaign against the Houthi Saleh forces, who are predominantly in northern Yemen, and have been carrying out this aerial bombing campaign against them and ground war since March 2015. Now, the US has put in a request to become more involved, particularly in an offensive that the Emiratis, the UAE, who are part of the Saudi-led coalition, are looking to launch on the Red Sea coast, particularly on the port of Hodeidah, which is a vital supply line for the northern Yemen, which is the most densely populated part of the country, which relies heavily on that route for the import of food. Now, the most troubling part of this request to become more involved with the Saudi-led coalition appears to be because there has been, certainly come out from the White House spokesman, this sense of conflating the Houthi rebels, who I mentioned, with Iran. Now, the Houthis have had support from Iran, and that appears to have been increasing with specific military assistance and weapons to the Houthis over the last 9 months. But to call them an Iranian proxy or to conflate them with Iran, it now appears that that this almost amounts to the US wanting to start a proxy war with Iran in Yemen. And of course, that is incredibly dangerous. It's incredibly dangerous for the civilian population who are already facing famine at the moment. And it's incredibly dangerous because we don't know what the reaction would be from Iran. That reaction may not just be in Yemen. It may be elsewhere in the region where they're also involved in wars, for example, in Syria. And that's really an unknown quantity. The known quantity is that the civilian population in Yemen will certainly suffer as a consequence of that if the Americans become more involved in the Saudi-led coalition's efforts in the country.
Iona Craig, I wanted to ask you about the Navy SEAL raid in Yemen in January that you've investigated. The White House warning journalists and lawmakers last month against criticizing the botched raid by U.S. commandos on a Yemeni village that left 25 civilians and one U.S. soldier dead, William Ryan Owens. The Bureau of Investigative Journalism reports the January 28th assault killed 9 children under the age of 13, with 5 other children wounded. Among those critical of the raid was Arizona Republican Senator John McCain.
When you lose a $75 million airplane, and more importantly, American life is lost and wounded, I don't believe that you can call it a success.
White House Press Secretary Sean Spicer lashed out at Senator McCain and journalists for criticizing President Trump's decision to order the raid.
It's absolutely a success. And I think anyone who would suggest it's not a success does disservice to the life of Chief Ryan Owens. He fought knowing what was at stake in that mission. And anybody who would suggest otherwise doesn't fully appreciate how successful that mission was, what the information that they were able to retrieve was, and how that will help prevent future terrorist attacks. I understand that. I think my statement's very clear on that, Kristen. I think anybody who undermines the success of that raid owes an apology and a disservice to the life of Chief Owens.
So that is Sean Spicer. President Trump, when he addressed a joint session of Congress, brought in the widow of Ryan Owens, but Ryan Owens' father, William Owens, refused to meet with President Trump when his son's body was brought to Dover Air Base, harshly critical of this raid, saying, why did he have to do this now, to move so quickly in his administration? Now, that was one Navy SEAL, and then you have the number of civilian casualties, women and children. What did you find, Iona?
Well, really, the civilians that I spoke to when I went to the village had exactly that same question. Why? Why did the Trump administration choose to carry out this raid? For what reasons? And what are they going to do about it now? Because not only did they put the lives of Navy SEALs at a huge amount of risk, which was highly predictable if you had even a vague understanding of the local politics in that particular area of Yemen at the time, but obviously caused mass civilian casualties. There were 26 people in that village who were killed. As you've already mentioned, many of those were women and children. That village has essentially been abandoned now because not only after that raid happened, not only was the entire village strafed and more than 120 livestock were killed, but the US went back a month later at the beginning of March and bombed it for 4 consecutive nights, both with drone strikes and helicopter gunfire, and killed 2 more children and several more adults. So the last person that I spoke to who was living there, Sheikh Aziz Al-Amri, he then left the village and is now living under trees several miles away. So the impact on the local population, who were essentially on the same side as the US in the civil war in Yemen at the moment. They were fighting against the Houthis, which is exactly what the US has been doing over the last 2 years. They've not only alienated the entire local population around there, but caused a huge amount of anti-American sentiment. And now tribesmen who were not al-Qaeda, who are not even al-Qaeda now, but were not before, but are now quite willing and wanting to fight the Americans as a result of this and a result of them killing their children and their wives. So I think what was quite clear before they even went in there was that, and what actually happened was the fact that all of the local tribesmen in that area came to defend the village when the US Navy SEALs went in there. And that was because they thought the village was being raided by the people they've been fighting for the last 2.5 years, which is the Houthis. They had no notion that it was Americans that were coming in to attack the village when it happened. And that was quite clearly a huge risk when the Americans went in there to carry out this raid, that would indeed happen. It's the middle of a civil war. That village is right behind the front lines. They had been receiving rocket fire and mortar fire from their opponents in the civil war in the days and weeks before the raid. So, of course, it was their assumption that their village was being stormed by the Houthi rebels who they'd been fighting for so long. So every man within hearing distance of gunfire came running. I spoke to a man who drove 45 minutes from his neighbouring village when he got the call to come and help defend his neighbour's area. And so I think the risk to the Navy SEALs was massive before they even went in there. It appears that there had been at least some knowledge within the village that they were in fact coming as well. And so for all those reasons, the Navy SEALs were being put under a huge amount of risk, and it was highly likely that one of their team was going to get killed, not to mention then the fact that they inevitably got pinned down by fire, then had to call in air support and basically decimate the entire village in order to be able to extract themselves safely from that situation. And from what I saw and talking to people, most of that was predictable before they even went in there.
Well, Iona, Craig, as you report in the piece, White House spokesperson Sean Spicer said the purpose of the raid was intelligence gathering and not specifically targeting anyone, and that initially the U.S. Central Command posted a video backing Spicer's claim, but that video was subsequently removed when it was proven that it was 10 years old.
Yeah, I mean, two things on that front. Certainly from what I was told, and in addition to statements that appear to have come out of the military since then, they were in fact going after the leader of al-Qaeda in the Arabian Peninsula, a man called Qasem al-Raymi. I think it's extremely unlikely that they would have been carrying out such a high-risk mission in order to gather laptops, cell phones, or intelligence, as they suggest. He was not in the village and, in fact, released an audio statement mocking both Trump and the raid several days later, although there were some low-level al-Qaeda militants there in one particular house. Because of the situation of how the Navy SEALs came under fire, that house was, in fact, bombed by an airstrike before the SEALs could even get into it. So whatever intelligence they claimed to have gathered from there would have come from other buildings where there were no al-Qaeda militants present. That video that you mentioned, that was when it was first posted, was labelled as an AQAP, so that's al-Qaeda in the Arabian Peninsula, video of how to make bombs. As you say, had turned out was 10 years old, had already been available on the internet. Well, AQAP, as it is now, didn't even exist 10 years ago. So even to label it as an AQAP video was kind of laughable, really. And if that's the best of the intelligence that came out of there, then it seems that that was a very high-risk undertaking for very little gain, if that's the best that they can show for it. But as I mentioned, certainly the people I spoke to on the ground, when I asked them about what houses the Navy SEALs got into, or perhaps access to the dead bodies who may have been carrying, let's say, cell phones or electrical equipment, they couldn't even clarify to me that the Navy SEALs had got inside buildings or had actually access to the dead. They couldn't say either way because of the chaos of the situation, it being extremely dark. They obviously didn't have night vision goggles like the Navy SEALs would have. So it wasn't even clear that they had, in fact, got into any buildings or not. So I think that's highly disputed, that intelligence. And it's certainly some of the claims being made over the last few days that the whole laptop ban was linked to intelligence gathered from the Yemen raid do not add up at all from what I've seen being written in the media on that as well.
Iona, we have less than a minute to go, but earlier this month, Amnesty International urged Trump to block future arms sales, writing, arming the Saudi Arabia and Bahrain governments risks complicity with war crimes, and doing so while simultaneously banning travel to the U.S. from Yemen would be even more unconscionable, Amnesty wrote. Front page story in the New York Times today, Secretary of State Rex Tillerson has decided to lift all human rights conditions on a major sale of F-16 fighter jets and other arms to Bahrain in an effort to end a rift between the United States and the critical Middle East ally. If you can very quickly talk about the role of U.S. weapons in these conflicts.
In Yemen, it's huge. The US is the biggest exporter to Saudi Arabia, and it's big business for the US. But of course, we know that the majority of civilian casualties in the war in Yemen have been caused by Saudi-led airstrikes. And the US has a huge influence over this. Those precision-guided weapons were suspended at the end of last year, and now we're looking at a resumption of that, where the US does actually have influence over Saudi Arabia, not just over Saudi Arabia, but also the continuation of this war, for the weapons that it sells to them and to the logistical support it gives the Saudi-led coalition in the terms of refueling and in the terms of targets as well. So it is obviously worrying for those people and campaigners who have been trying to prevent the sale of weapons to Saudi Arabia, but also the terms of those sales. There are indications now that those weapons may be sold under commercial terms rather than under military, which also then doesn't attach the same end-use issues with them. So there isn't so much scrutiny then with the end use of those weapons in a war like Yemen, and that's also deeply concerning. So I think now at a stage where really the attempt should be made to de-escalate the conflict. All indications are now that, in fact, the war in Yemen will be escalated by the activities of the US government now.
One last, very quickly, Iona, that as we said in our introduction, there have been more airstrikes carried out since the start of 2017 than there were in all of 2016. But you've pointed out in a recent interview that there were more drone strikes in Yemen over the space of 36 hours than there were in all of 2016.
Yes, absolutely. And even in the last 24 hours, there have been US airstrikes, and not just airstrikes, there's naval bombardments as well, which, of course, were being done under the Obama administration. But those airstrikes have been carried out in Abiyan province, in Shabwa, in Hadramaut, in Marib, in the last 24 hours, in Marib, in Shabwa, and in Abiyan, and also in Al-Baida as well, earlier on in March. So, yes, there's definitely there's not just this surge at the beginning of March where we saw that 36 hours of airstrikes happening very rapidly, but that's been a continuation as well now. And as I say, it's not just drone strikes; it's airstrikes from fighter jets, and it's also coming from the sea.
Iona Craig, I want to thank you for being with us. Freelance journalist who was based in Sana'a for years, has continued to go back and forth reporting on what's happening there. Thanks so much for joining us. This is Democracy Now! When we come back, the U.S. is leading a boycott of UN talks on a nuclear ban. We'll find out why. Stay with us.
Inside this mess, they've lost themselves. Come look at them. Come and see them crawling to satisfy their vanity. So you say now modern times have gone, that no human must be left behind, that all should rush forward with tire, life for sale, debauchery, no dignity, I said, free tickets to hell, don't have to pay. Beware, my bro, not to break your legs on this path. What a shame, and what a shame.
What a Shame by Sue Mood here on Democracy Now!, democracynow.org, The War and Peace Report. I'm Amy Goodman with Nermeen Sheikh.
We turn now to a historic debate at the United Nations. Some 120 countries gathered this week to draft a treaty to ban nuclear weapons. But the United States did not take part. In fact, the U.S. led a boycott of the talks. This is U.S. Ambassador to the UN, Nikki Haley.
You are going to see almost 40 countries that are not in the General Assembly today. And that's 40 countries that are saying, in this day and time, we would love to have a ban on nuclear weapons. But in this day and time, we can't honestly say that we can protect our people by allowing the bad actors to have them, and those of us that are good trying to keep peace and safety not to have them.
U.S. Ambassador to the UN Nikki Haley was joined by envoys from Britain, France, South Korea and other nations in opposing the UN talks on nuclear weapons ban treaty. Russia and China have also declined to participate in the conference. We're joined now by Zia Mir, physicist, nuclear expert and disarmament activist, co-director of the Program on Science and Global Security at the Woodrow Wilson School of Public and International Affairs at Princeton University. He's co-author of Unmaking the Bomb, a fissile material approach to nuclear disarmament and non-proliferation. What's happening here? Why is the U.S. leading this boycott?
The news is not that the U.S. is leading a boycott. We knew the United States wasn't going to participate and that it's been trying to force its nuclear NATO allies also to not participate. The news here is that after 70 years, the vast majority of countries in the world have decided they've had enough of waiting for the United States and the other countries with nuclear weapons to keep their promise that they would get rid of nuclear weapons and said, enough is enough. We are now going to create an international treaty that will ban nuclear weapons, and you are going to be nuclear outlaws, and you're going to have to deal with this new reality.
So how did these nations come together now?
It's taken years and years of effort by non-weapon states and peace movements around the world to build the kind of coalition that it's taken to bring a resolution to the United Nations last year, in which 123 countries, as you mentioned, voted in support of the beginning of talks. The United States tried actively to block that resolution being passed. It actually sent a classified memo to all of the NATO allies the U.S. protects with its nuclear weapons, saying, don't support this resolution at the United Nations, and if the resolution passes, don't go or else. It was actively threatening its own allies to make sure they wouldn't participate, because they know that in many of the countries in Europe in particular, and in countries like Japan, which are protected by U.S. nuclear weapons, public opinion and many parliaments are actually in favor of joining the process to ban nuclear weapons. And it's taken a lot of effort by the United States to keep these countries out of the process.
Trump said recently, if countries are going to have nukes, we're going to be at the top of the pack. And, of course, you had Nikki Haley saying, sure, I'd like a nuclear ban, but what about North Korea? Your response, what has to happen?
Well, you can't wait for the worst actors in the world before you pass laws about what's right and wrong. If that was the way the world worked, we would never have banned slavery. If you had to wait for slave owners to agree in advance that slavery is a bad thing. What countries are doing is laying down a marker, just like we did with chemical weapons, biological weapons, landmines, cluster munitions, and creating the laws of war, that simple humanitarian principles apply. There are limits on what states are allowed to do, no matter what. You don't commit genocide. You don't use chemical weapons, biological weapons, and you shouldn't use nuclear weapons. And we're going to pass a law that says having nuclear weapons and threatening to use nuclear weapons and using nuclear weapons is forbidden under international law. And if you're going to keep your weapons, then you are going to be on the outside of what the international community considers is acceptable.
What about other nuclear weapon states, India, Pakistan, and so on? Did they issue any statement about why they wouldn't participate?
They haven't said why they wouldn't participate, but what happened when the UN was passing the resolution at the end of last year, which the US tried to block, was that China and India and Pakistan abstained. They didn't vote no, unlike the United States and Russia and Britain and so on. And there was a possibility that at some stage in the future they might actually think about joining the negotiations, even if they're not ready right now to sign the treaty, because it's hard to imagine that countries like China, which have 250 nuclear weapons, are going to agree on a process to ban nuclear weapons, where the United States, which has 7,000 nuclear weapons, is going to sit outside this treaty.
President Trump has proposed slashing the budgets of the NIH, the National Institutes of Health. At the same time, proposed boosting federal spending on the production of nuclear weapons by more than $1 billion. Your final response?
Well, the Trump administration's plan to increase spending on nuclear weapons is perfectly consistent with what President Obama's administration was also doing, which was increasing spending on nuclear weapons. There is a shared commitment by the U.S. policymaking process on spending $1 trillion over the next 30 years to modernize the nuclear weapons, the submarines, the bombers, and every part of the nuclear weapons production complex to get ready for 100 more years of nuclear weapons. And this is part of what this UN process is trying to block, which is that we are not willing to live with nuclear weapons for another 100 years.
We're going to ask you to stay with us. We'll do part 2 of our conversation and post it online as a web exclusive at democracynow.org. Zia Mian, physicist, nuclear expert, and disarmament activist, co-director of the Program on Science and Global Security at the Woodrow Wilson School of Public International Affairs at Princeton University. And he's author of the book on Making the Bomb, a fissile material approach to nuclear disarmament and nonproliferation. That does it for our broadcast. Full-time news production fellow, I'm Amy Goodman with Nermeen Sheikh.